If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, people who hike, camp, explore deep woods, etc., what did you see out there that you're too afraid to talk about, but you can't forget? I'm staying in Pigeon Forge, near the Smoky Mountains, right now, in a cabin in the woods. There's another cabin nearby, though. I was dead asleep last night, and my boyfriend was still outside in the hot tub when he came inside, yelling for me, and woke me up. He said that he started hearing something big moving around in the forest, and he thought it was a bear, but he shined his flashlight, and it was like something small moving through the grasses that he couldn't see. There were multiple of them, but they were covered by the grass and moving in different directions. He only saw one, but it was a little way in the distance, and he described it as long and tan and skin colored like a person that was on their belly slithering around but moving really fast and racefully. Then, as clear as day, he heard a woman's voice scream, "Help me. Someone." And he says it was the weirdest sound, like it didn't sound like a real person, it sounded rehearsed and fake, and he couldn't tell where it was coming from. Anyone know what this is? We're freaked. Okay, so I know many people won't believe me when I share this, but it really happened, and I am 100% sure. To start with, my friends and I always walked to this town center after school when we were freshmen. It was a very popular place, and there were lots of people eating, studying, and doing all sorts of other things. My best friend Julia and her cousin Kyle were sitting at a table seated outdoors, and we were just eating and talking. The table was very small, so we were very close together. It was still light out, and the weather was very sunny and cloudy. But Julia and I were talking to each other about something, and then suddenly Kyle pointed at something and said, "What the duck, it's a ferry," and when he said that, at the moment I imagined a ferry as in a boat, but that's irrelevant. Anyway, I tilted my head to see where Kyle was pointing, and then I saw a bug-like creature in the middle of the air. When my eyes focused, I saw a pair of tiny legs, and the skin tone was the skin tone of a human and not a bug. It was wearing a brown or green dress, and the wings weren't sparkly or anything but something similar to a hummingbird's wings. Then, as soon as I saw it, it flew up and disappeared. This all happened in a span of 2 seconds. When it disappeared, all three of us just sat there in shock and speechless for about 5 seconds. Then we all described what we saw, and we definitely saw the same thing. I don't know what this means, but it's been almost 2 years since it happened, and I wasn't sure if anyone believed me or had a similar experience. So this happened a few years ago, in my spring break senior year of high school. I was hiking part of the Long Trail / which goes south from Glastonbury to Bennington, and it was the usual very cold nights and warm, muddy days Vermont usually has in the spring, so pretty fun to hike in. I was going to take a day and rest my feet, go swimming in a pond, and cool off, so I took a detour onto the Bald Mountain Trail. I got to my campsite around 5, and the sun was setting, so I set up my hammock and rain tarp and made a fire. I made some Mountain House beef stroganoff and decided to just lay down and watch the fire. I hadn't seen anyone since before noon, which is unusual because it's a pretty well-traveled section of the trail. I started to get really uneasy, and it definitely felt like someone was watching me from a distance. I ended up sitting with my back against a maple, facing the fire, and holding my camp knife. A few hours later, 9:10-ish, I heard a really loud crash in the woods, like a plane falling out of the sky or a freight train right next to me. Then there was dead silence. No wind, no leaves, no owls, just dead quiet. I remember getting really uncomfortable and shouting out to see if there was anyone out there, but I just started hearing a really subtle droning noise, like a key being rubbed on a bass string or radio static but super low pitched. I didn't sleep at all that night, I just watched the moon go really slowly over the sky, and the sound got quieter as it got lighter outside. When I could see well enough to walk, I picked up my gear and sprinted back to the main trail. I found some people up early and hiked with them all the way back. This happened a few years ago. I've only told a few people, and I'm afraid everyone will think I'm crazy. I'd hiked this trail many times before. The trailhead is only 5 miles out of town, and you have cell signal the whole time, one of the bigger reasons I felt comfortable doing it solo so many times. I spent the first mile up the mountain talking to my sister on the phone. I heard leaves crunching off the trail a few times, but with all the wildlife out there, I didn't think much of it and continued on with our talk. After we hung up, I took a quick break to catch my breath and grab a drink of water. I continued on for about 5 minutes, enjoying the quiet of the forest and the initial colors of the sun starting to set. I heard someone walking quickly a little ways down from the trail. I assumed it was someone at a switchback further down. As I turned to look, I see an all-black figure walking upright like a human. My brain is trying to make sense of it, Maybe a super skinny bear walking on its hind legs? I continue to watch as it walks behind a tree, and I'm waiting for it to appear on the other side. But nothing. It disappears, and so does the sound of its footsteps. It's absolutely silent. I've never been so terrified in my entire life, and I immediately started looking around for some sort of weapon. The best I can find is a dried out stick. That was the first time I started that trail and didn't finish, but I wanted nothing more than to be back in my car. It took me over 2 years to hike that trail again. This happened a few years ago, but I was reminded of it today after watching a hiking vlog. I was on the return leg of an overnight hike, on a rough track cut through thick scrubby forest. It was a warm, sunny afternoon with no wind, and I was almost drowsy. There was the sound of children's voices ahead, a bit too far away to be distinct. I thought this was odd, as it was a couple hours walk from the road end, and they sounded fairly young. It was the usual sort of fitful kids conversation, and although it got louder as I got closer, I still couldn't quite distinguish the words. The talking died down and ended completely when I was almost on top of them. There, I got a shock. Where I thought the children were was not the track. It was a steep, thickly wooded gully, with a trickle of water at the bottom just visible through the scrub. This was terrain I would go well out of my way to avoid. I was confused because the children hadn't sounded panic-stricken, and surely they'd never go down there intentionally. I called out and pushed in some way, but there was no response. I lost a bit of skin looking around and eventually guiltily gave up the search. I monitored the news sites for any mention of lost children when I got home, but there was nothing. There's not much more to tell. I did an internet search for kids lost there in the past, but it was in the back blocks, and there wasn't much information about the area at all. Some years ago, I'd say 2014 or 2015, my sister and I were scouring all the hiking trails in San Jose, and one afternoon we decided upon a small but semi-reputable sounding one. We parked after surviving a badly made one-way road and started out with our dog around 3 to 3:30. The trail markers weren't in great condition, but we still easily found a main path to a scenic overview. It was a 20 to 30 minute hike that curved gently around a giant rock and was relatively straightforward. We got to the overlook, admiring views of a dam and town for a good minute before turning around to start back. We turned around, and it was as if the straightforward trail we'd just been on had vanished and there was only one to the left going up and one to the right going down. At first, we thought, okay, this is weird, but let's just get back. I tried the path going up and around a hill, but it didn't seem right. At this point, I said, well, the gate's close in 45 minutes, we have time if we can connect back with the trail we took. So we went back to the one heading down and somehow kept going further down the mountain when it should have joined with the main one. We knew something was wrong when the direction wasn't changing and it was getting dark. So keep in mind that we parked at 3-ish, got to the overlook at 4, and by 6 to 6:30 were lost. Thank you for everything. I brought my mobile charger, and there was a clear spot with reception halfway up the trail we were on and at the top where it intersected. I had to call 911, and I had to call the park service to get someone to pick us up. The listed park's emergency numbers were useless. Once we were rescued, it was a good 15-minute drive back to the lot. Had the main road been that long, we never would have made it to the scenic overlook with the sun still up. It was a 20 to 30 minute walk on an obvious main trail with plenty of light still, and we ended up needing a drive back that would have taken us 2 hours to walk. Not to mention my sister's dog, who is typically very good at knowing where to go, was frightened and confused. We are convinced we got caught in a vortex or time warp of some kind because we can't explain how a fairly short walk put us hours away from the car. When I was 10, I went camping with my mom, baby sister, aunt, uncle, and their 3 kids. It was fall in Canada. Mom, sis, and I shared a tent. While the others did too. I'll never forget the dreams I had that night. My sister was only about 3 at the time. So in the dream, I woke up in the early hours of the morning, like 2 to 3 a.m., from the cold wind blowing on my face. I woke up and noticed the tent zip door opened and my sister standing right outside, pointing at the sky while looking at me. I immediately forcefully shut my eyes and covered my head with the sleeping bag shell, and then I felt this cold chill literally run through my body, from my head to my toes. After about 3 to 5 minutes, I peeked out from under the camping bag shell and found that everything was back to normal. Mom and sis were asleep. I was like, wow, that was weird. So I got comfy, and still frightened, I forcefully shut my eyes and went back to sleep. Or so I thought. All of a sudden again, with the cold wind on my face, the tent door opened, but this time I saw my sister standing out near the water waving for me to come over. But when I looked to the right of me in the tent, my mom and sister were laying asleep. So then why do I also see my sister standing out and waving me over? The scariest thing then happened as she left out this high-pitched bark call that sounded like she said hey or here. Almost as a person who doesn't speak English would say it. I again closed my eyes and forced myself to go to sleep. Only to have the same dream over and over for the rest of the night. When I woke up in the morning and got ready to fish with my uncle and my cousins, right where my sister was standing in the dream, there were these stab wounds on the dirt ground near the water. The stab wounds look like something you would do to a piece of pork shoulder before marinating it. There are just tiny little openings on the floor. To this day, I'm still confused about what happened that night, and the only reason I'm sharing this story is because the night after, I kept having the same dream. Where the tent was opened, there was a cold breeze on my face and Mom and Sis laying next to me asleep, but this time it was this tiny deer-like animal that was standing near the water in a high-pitched bark sounding like hey or here. I was born in 2002, and my entire childhood I was obsessed with fairies. At some point, I began to get pieces of paper and write messages to fairies. I would tape them in various fairy places around my house. I had one above my bed, and the last one I put up before I saw the fairies was on a chair on my outside porch. I always wrote, asking for them to visit me. I remember they finally came one night at 3:10 a.m. I randomly woke up and saw tiny little balls of light around the piles of books I kept in bed. Until this event, I had always pictured fairies as looking like little people with wings. One of them, or a few of them, I don't remember, were singing something. I remember the lights being red, orange, and yellow. Unfortunately, although I had always wanted to meet them, after a few seconds, I screamed and ran to my parents' room, where I slept in their bed. The next day, I drew pictures of the lights and showed them to my parents. I don't think I still have the picture, but sometime soon I'm going to look around for it. I regretted running away from them, and once college apps are finished, I'm going to spend the winter trying to figure out what happened and if I can contact the fairies again. All of the things I've read online about people meeting fairies describe them as people. Do you guys think the balls of light were something other than fairies? Additionally, some people think that what happened was a dream since I was into fairies and it happened in the night, but y'all gotta trust me that it really was real. I live in a small city in Texas currently, but I grew up in a small town about an hour and 30 minutes away. When I visit my family and go home afterwards, I have two different roads I can take. One is through the highway, and the other, which is slightly faster, is through the back roads. The back roads mainly consist of empty farm roads with nothing but windmills and farmland. Occasionally, there are one or two cars, but most of the time, they're empty. That day, I decided to go through the back roads. My roommate, who had also come to visit her family, was driving behind me in her truck. It was around 6 p.m., and the sun was about to set but not fully set, leaving the sky with an orangey hue. As we were driving through the back roads, I saw something up ahead, crouched next to a bush. As I get closer, I see that it's white, its skin looks leathery, and its legs are extremely long. As I pass it, it jumps over my car onto a tree on the other side of the road. During this moment, I don't react for some reason. I keep driving, looking ahead with a blank face. It feels as if I'm in a trance. When the thing jumped over my car, I was able to see how long its legs actually were. It jumped off the ground like a spring that was pushed down, then let go. It had equally long arms, and overall, it basically looked like a tall, large proportioned human. For some reason, I could have also sworn I saw a hat on him. The best way I could describe it is like the white spy from Spy vs. Spy. Picture that spy, but with long arms and legs as well as a thin torso. Like I said, I felt like I was in a trance. I drove and drove with my friend behind me until we got to our apartment. The whole way, my mind was blank for the life of me. I can't explain how my mind and body felt. We got home, and I had completely forgotten about it, and neither my roommate nor I brought it up. Until about 2 weeks later, me and my roommate were drinking, and for some reason she said something that instantly reminded me of that day. I looked at her and asked her, "Do you remember that time we were driving in the back roads and that thing jumped over my car?" She instantly remembered and told me she felt like, after it happened, she was lost in a trance as well. She described the thing exactly the way I pictured it. However, from her point of view, she definitely saw it a lot clearer. I still can't explain what exactly it was we saw, why we were in a trance after we saw it, or why we completely forgot about it until that night. If anyone has any theories, or maybe a logical explanation, I would love to hear them. I sometimes stay awake at night, thinking whatever it was might show up again and take me. I still drive down the same road, hoping I might come across it again. I'm not afraid, I'm just so confused. It must have been 15 years ago. I live in a wooded part of the Netherlands. To clarify things, that means you usually only encounter people every hour or two, which is hardly comparable with wooded areas in Canada or the United States. It was January and pretty cold, our little country was covered in snow, and it was a Friday night. Like every Friday, it was time for me to visit my friends, get drunk, and have a couple of laughs. So, like every 17-year-old with the drive to party, I jumped on my bike and started pedaling. My friend lives about 8 kilometers, about 5 miles, from me. For the last 3 years, I've been going there 3 times a week, so you can say I know the road like the back of my hand. The first part is a normal paved road with street lights and a car passing me every minute or so. The second part is still a paved road, but without streetlights. The headlight on my bike didn't work, but that didn't matter because it was a clear sky with a, nearly, full moon, and like I said, the ground was covered in snow, so visibility was great. At one point, I got a weird feeling and thought I heard someone scream or yell at me, so I took off my headphones. There was this eerie silence around me, no animals, no wind, no cars, nothing. Boom. Nothing ruins an uneasy moment like falling flat on your face because of the icy road. I got up and checked if I had tore up my jeans. All was okay, so I got back on my bike, put on my headphones, and started paddling again. A couple of minutes later, I neared a bend in the road and saw someone with his back towards me a little off-road in the bushes. It was cold and it was dark, but there are people living there, so I wrote it off as someone walking his dog. As I got closer, I noticed that the guy was pretty big with a top hat on and that I could not see his dog. Because I already tasted the snowy road once that night, I decided to slow down a bit so his dog would not scare the shit out of me. When I was about 10 meters away, the guy really got my attention, no dog, a top hat, and he wore a cape or some really weird jacket. When I was about to pass him by, he turned around, and to this day, I will not forget that moment. I stared into 2 deep orange eyes with razor-sharp white teeth beneath them. Being almost 2 meters in height and practicing martial arts since I was 7, I'm not a guy that scares easily, but at that moment, I was filled with terror. After a second that felt like an hour, I saw that man's, or should I say thing? Arms come towards me. In that second, my adrenaline and my fight or flight instinct kicked in, so I started paddling like I never had before. The last part of my ride was filled with my heart trying to come out of my chest. I didn't dare look back or do anything else except put all my effort into getting away from there. As I arrived at my friend's house, I dropped my bike at the front door and immediately locked it. So, what did I see? This happened in 2013, at a house in which my wife and I lived for 23 years, and on January 1st to 2nd, about midnight at the end of New Year's Day. The house was across a 2-lane road from a locally well-known creek lined with woody corridors on both sides. I was at the kitchen table, on the internet. My wife was with our dog outside for the final time before bed. She came bustling into the mud room at the back of the house, next to the kitchen, unharnessed the dog, and came to the kitchen door a bit out of breath. She said, "Han, I think you should go outside and see about something." She explained that while she and the dog were out on the front lawn, she heard someone walking down the middle of the creek. This was not a normal occurrence at any time of day or year, but especially at midnight in the winter. The creek was partially frozen, with a thin layer of ice in some places but open, flowing water in others. The creek is deep enough for canoes to navigate during the summer. There are a few streetlights, the light of which is partially obscured by the wood corridor between them and the creek. Even the dog heard this activity, turning and looking towards the creek. According to her, it sounded like regular, heavy, bipedal walking by someone of size, not like a quadrupedal animal such as a deer. The level of the creek is about 10 feet lower than the surrounding terrain, so to see down into it, one would have to go to the opposite shoulder of the road and stand by the long guardrail that runs there. Whoever this walker was, the direction of travel was eastward, downstream, and headed towards eventually emptying into a large lake near the next town. My wife was reluctant to cross the road and look. I should hurry if I want to hear it. So I got on my coat and went out, but it was too late to hear the footsteps. Carrying a flashlight, I went to the guardrail. No one and nothing but the creek. So I decided to take a look in the morning, in case there was a trackway. And the next morning, I did find what looked like a bipedal trackway made by hominin feet. It was right down the center of the creek. But it was too far for me to get a clear idea about further characteristics. I couldn't judge the footprint size or whether they were shod. Their stride was long, but I had no way of measuring how long. So once more, the investigator's axiom is something or nothing. Okay, so this happened to me while I was completing my Canadian Armed Forces Medical Technician Primary Care Paramedic portion in Chilliwack, BC, in 2011. I'm going to keep this short, and I will update after I get in touch with an artist about what I've seen. Around late spring of 2011, I was driving a rented old Ford Bronco around Cultus Lake. I was just coming around the sharp bend on the road that heads around the lake, right before you get up to the small farm community on the Canada-US border. It was about 0230-ish, memory is starting to fade, and I noticed a deer in the middle of the road. I thought to myself, the poor thing must have been hit, so I continued on for my little excursion. I turned around at the bend and headed back along the border back to the main road. I did this drive almost nightly, just to get out of the shacks, basically. I came around the turn, completely forgetting about the deer until I saw it. Thick dark brown/black fur eating the deer, whatever it was turned and looked me square in the eyes. It glared at me, black eyes, no sclera, just the reflection of the truck lights. It wasn't staring at the high beams, it knew where I sat. My blood pressure spiked immediately, and the tinnitus began to grow louder. This was fear, this was true fear. I had never experienced this before. It picked up the deer by its throat and stood up. It was taller than the vehicle, and it walked off into the woods towards the mountain. I rolled forward, rolled down the window, and dimmed the lights in the cab. It was still looking at me. The smell of death. Yeah, it was death. By that time, I was used to the smell. It made a sound to this day I cannot forget, a deep vocal warning, low and loud. Needless to say, I got out of there as fast as I could. What did I see? Anyone familiar with the area who has seen something or heard something similar? 4 August 16th. Many people are saying that what I've seen is a Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I was reluctant to say that's what I've seen because I've always been on the fence about believing in the mainstream idea of those creatures. After what I've seen, I can say that I fully believe that something is living out there that we have not yet discovered. However, for now, instead of calling it a Sasquatch or Bigfoot, I'll keep calling it. This incident took place in the spring of 2005 on a road called Spooks Hill Road. At the time, I was 17 and riding my motorcycle back from my friend's place. It was the time of day when the sun had already set, but it wasn't quite nighttime yet. The sky was a dark blue, and the woods were pitch black. I think this is called twilight hour. I was on a sport bike and thoroughly enjoying the twisty nature of the road, fairly in excess of the posted 25-mile-per-hour speed limit. I had my high beams on to see further through the turns and came upon a wider right turn in the road with the guardrail on the inside of the turn. The reservoir was also on the right side of the road, but there were a few hundred feet of woods between it and the road. As I came upon the apex of the turn, I was a few feet away from the guardrail and saw what I can only describe as a girl aged 6-8 years old on the outside of the guardrail. She wasn't illuminated per se, but the headlight definitely made her white clothing light up. She appeared to be wearing a gown of sorts. Almost like one of those old-timey night gowns. Her hands were on the guardrail, and I saw her head follow me as I went by. I was probably going 50 miles per hour or so at the time, so I didn't have much time to look at her, but what stuck out the most was that she had no face. There was just black there. The hair on my neck stood up so fast that it hurt. As soon as I was able to, I slowed to a stop. The rational part of my brain told me there might be a young girl lost in the woods. The primal part of my brain was telling me to get the hell out of there. I had gone too far past the turn to see the apex where she was, so I turned around. Like a white guy in a horror movie. I slowly went by the turn, looking at the spot where she had been, and saw nothing. Then I tried to reproduce the incident by going by fast again, hoping it was some sort of optical illusion with the headlight, still nothing where she was. After the incident, I rode home. Once there, I told my grandmother about the incident and how thoroughly creeped out I was. My grandmother, a super religious lady, said she believes it may have been my guardian angel and that its appearance forced me to slow down, possibly preventing me from hitting a deer or something. I'm not very spiritual at all, but it is a nice perspective on a creepy incident that I can't explain. My friend and I lived out of town, maybe 30 kilometers, 18 miles, from the nearest town. One full moon night, we invited a friend over for some beers. We went out into the woods for a walk because we were bored, and suddenly the friend we invited over says, "Ducking run boys," and sprints off back to the house. He said it in a genuinely scared voice, and it was heaps spooky out there, so we kind of just jogged back to the house in fear. When we got back, he said he saw the rake. We didn't know what it was, so he showed us a picture of it off the internet. We kind of just shrugged it off and got on with our night. The next weekend, my friend and I were having some beers on the balcony, and we saw yellow, glowing eyes staring at us from the woods, so we went back inside. That's all that happened that night. Every now and then after that, weird stuff would happen occasionally at night. The power got turned off, we heard scratches on the windows, and we'd hear weird groaning outside, and then the dog would go nuts, barking and sometimes yelping, which was odd because nothing really happened on our property. One night, when the dog was going off, my friend and I checked to see what was going on. We opened the back door, and we saw a bald, gray, lanky humanoid creature with pitch black eyes. It instantly ran off on all fours immediately after we made eye contact. This scared the shit out of us and confirmed what happened to the friend we invited over. For weeks, we'd try to catch the creature on camera to show our friends why we were so paranoid about it. They thought we were going crazy. We saw it a couple more times but never had the camera on us. So we made a plan. We invited the friend who first saw it over on a full moon night, grabbed our machetes, and I had a kitchen knife, and we went out into the woods to go kill the thing. We saw it maybe 20 minutes into the hunt, and it ran off. We tried running after it, but it was so quick, quicker than any animal we'd seen. This happened several times, but we were determined to catch and kill the beast. Our search led us deep, deep into the woods. We were lost, but we kept going. We start hearing the groaning, and my friend's dog takes off into the shrub. We hear growling and barking, and then his dog starts yelping heaps badly. We ran after it and saw the Rake up close. It has his dog pinned on the ground with its hands around its throat, but yet again, when we got close, it took off into the woods. At this point, we went home. We decided not to duck with or look for the Rake after that. I now live in the city and haven't been bothered by it since. In 1999, I was 7 years old, playing in the woods with my friend Charlotte. We were standing at each end of a big log in the woods when I noticed movement in my peripherals. I tried focusing my periphery to catch a detailed look. I see similar movement often when we're in the woods, and it always disappears, more like scatters, before I turn to look. My heart skipped a beat when I could make out a group of little people looking up at me as well. I was frozen in the pose I was playing in, and after a few seconds, I realized Charlotte had stopped narrating the play and was frozen in place as well, staring at me but focusing on them. I'm pretty sure they were dressed because it didn't look like they were all naked. I could tell they knew we were aware of them, and they dispersed as Charlotte moved her eyes. We didn't talk about it until we were in her house. We weren't afraid, just confused on our walk home. We wrote out what we saw before talking about it, to see if we saw the same thing. Unfortunately, both our descriptions were so vague, but clothed, less than a foot, for sure. One thing we were positive of was to mind our business and not go searching, which is what our instinct would have usually been. We thought we had found a colony of little people in the woods. But the fact that our reaction was to quietly leave and not even talk about it until behind closed doors, and still not even talk out loud but write it. I don't remember being too frightened. In fact, we kind of just accepted it and moved on with a new taste of what this world and universe are capable of. I live near a very large, very popular national park. Locals here, like myself, are pretty aware of the goings-on near here, strange sounds, strange creatures, and strange disappearances. I have dealt with these myself in the past on hikes and even just relaxing in the park. Here is one that still freaks me out to this day. I was at my grandma's house, which is deep in the boonies. The only road there is a gravel road that is pretty much washed away, so without a good car, you're not getting out there anyway. My cousins lived in a trailer with their moms right below my grandma's. We played all sorts of games, which mainly involved me getting chased. I was the youngest. My grandma was in the hospital with my aunt, so our older cousin, who I'll name D, had to watch us. D was, and still is, the only cousin that's older than us that we still hold in high regard. He would mess with us and play around but actually cared about us. The whole day we spent playing around, but we would usually play more at night, like hide and seek, tag, etc. We had been playing pretty far away from the house, and it was starting to get dark. We decided to go back to the house, grab flashlights, and play manhunt. Of course, I was the one being hunted. I ran pretty far into the woods on the other side of the property and hid behind a log. I heard my cousins getting close, so I ran, and they saw me. We ended up running to the very back of the property line, almost a mile from the house, and we saw my cousin D. He looked at us and kind of growled, and we all ran from him, thinking it was a game. We ran back onto the gravel road, and we saw him walk out of the tree line, but he did something weird, kind of gloatingly in a way. We ran into the house and decided to barricade the door to play a prank on him. We moved a couple of things in front of the door, but decided to move the big coffee table in front of it too. As we loudly scooted the table across the floor, D came into the living room from the master bedroom, running his eyes. We had obviously woken him up from all the movement, and he was mad. We told him about seeing him chase us, and he got wide-eyed. He told us to go to our bedroom and stay there. We sat in the bedroom for about 20 minutes, and he came in and told us not to worry. It was just him scaring us, and we went on with the night. It wasn't until about 3 years later, when I was 13. He told me the truth. It was a Skinwalker. He told me that he had dealt with it when he was our age, and he told me his story. This happened to my buddy and me when I was at college during the winter of 2010. I was and still am an outdoorsy guy who has been at home in the woods for a very long time. I've seen and heard a lot, but I've never had an experience like this. I met my buddy at college that first semester, and we became fast friends. Before I knew it, he was inviting me back to his family's place that winter to stay there and do a bit of hog hunting. I have hunted hogs since I was old enough to hunt, so I jumped at the chance. We got to his parents' place, and holy hell, it was beautiful. They own about 1,500 acres out in rural West Texas. His family raises, shows, and sells cattle and is loaded. They are amazing people, and they kind of took to me like a second son. Over my time at college, I visited them a lot. But since his family is avid hunters and the land they live on is mainly for cattle, they own another 1,000 acres they lease to hunters and also use themselves to hunt on. So after a day or two at their primary ranch, we set out to the hunting lease. It was just my buddy and myself. No hunters had leased it that winter yet. We set up our stuff at the little hunting cabin they had and set our alarms to wake us up at 6 a.m. We got some rest and woke up ready to get out to the stand. Being wild college kids, we brought the whiskey and coke and our rifles. Spare me the lectures, we were stupid college kids. We got to the stand after a short hike through the cold and hopped on up into the stand. It was one of those big green metal stands that's elevated about 15 to 20 feet in the air. The area it was set up facing was perfect. To the left, about 100 yards, was a mostly caliche rock clearing with trees lining it and dead cactus. In front of us was a wider clearing with sparse trees and various weeds and grass. To the right, a decently dense patch of trees, and behind us was a dense patch of trees and a high fence about 30 yards back. We could not see behind us because the blindness he had was only 180 degrees. Just a back wall and a door with a window that was boarded up because the glass or whatever it had in it was broken. We just set up the chairs, started drinking, and the waiting began. We had a beautiful view of the area and the sunrise coming from the east of where we were. We didn't see anything the first hour, so we just kept drinking and chatting. About an hour after the sun rose, we started hearing some limbs breaking and brushes rustling from behind us. It sounded a good way back, maybe 50 years or more. We readied our rifles, hoping that what we were certain were hogs would circle around. I remember sitting there just waiting, watching the fog from my breath for a good 5 minutes. The rustling got closer, and then I noticed a really metallic smell. The best way I can describe it is the smell crappy tools give off when you don't take care of them. It's kind of like a mix of copper, vomit, and poop. I looked at my bud and whispered, "You smell that?" And he nodded and shrugged his shoulders. A minute later, we're still waiting, the rustling seems to get closer. Then it just kind of stopped. After a couple minutes, I could still smell the stink but no noise, and I figured maybe a couple hogs had taken a dump near the stand and moved on. I reached to pick up the bottle as my buddy puts his rifle down, and just as we're doing that, we hear a scream or grunt. I have never heard anything like it. It was like a low grunt that escalated into a gravelly scream, and it sounded like it was right outside the back of the room. Before we could ever really react, we heard a bunch of twigs and branches snap. It sounded like it was right outside the back of the room. Not a couple seconds later, we feel the entire blind shake about 3 times, like if a car had bumped into it. I dropped the bottle of whiskey and just looked at my friend, and he looked just as freaked out as I felt. We heard a loud, singular grunt, and then the sound of twigs and branches breaking again slowly got quieter. We just sat there, too freaked out to move for what felt like an hour but was only about 10 minutes. I don't know if it was the whiskey or just me trying to be brave, but I got up and opened the door, and nothing was there. We climbed down and had our rifles ready. We both knew it wasn't a hog but tried to convince ourselves it was. We could see the old stand marks on the ground, and the whole stand had rocked forward about 6 inches. There was a bent portion of one of the metal struts and 2 big depressions where it looked like feet had dug into the rocky ground. We figured whatever stood there was rocking the stand. We stood there looking dumbfounded, and we just decided to get the hell out of there. We drove back to his main house and told his dad. He said to just stay at their house with them for the night, and we would go check it out tomorrow. When we got there the day after, we saw the same things that were there the day prior, and his dad was super confused. I don't think he initially believed us when we told him about what happened. We found where whatever it was had come from. There was a clear path in the grass leading away from the stand, where it had been depressed and you could see tree limbs broken. The highest one that was broken off was about 7 feet off the ground. We walked back 30 yards to the high fence that was there, and sure enough, about a 4-foot wide section had been mangled and bent down. His dad was pissed, Obviously, but he was also really confused. He told us that he had never had this happen and reckoned it was just a giant hog, but I never thought so. I don't want to just say it's Bigfoot, but I have never had an explanation as to what could have caused that. Over the years, I've grown to believe in Bigfoot more and more. My dad had an encounter with what he claims could have been Bigfoot as well, so maybe it runs in the family? I don't believe in the paranormal, but I do love the stories. Nevertheless, I have had a few odd experiences in my life. This is one of them. I didn't own a car during my first year in California, so I would periodically rent one for weekend excursions from the nearby enterprise. I'd pay for the car, and then the rental agent and I would go over the car to agree upon existing damage and scuff marks, then I would take the keys and drive away. Usually, this was uneventful. But one Friday, as I took the keys from the rental agent and prepared to leave, as soon as I made contact with the car to open the door, I had what I guess could be called a premonition. I will hit and kill a dog with this car, was the thought that suddenly entered my mind. The thought of killing any animal with a car is very distressing to me. I've hit a few rabbits and squirrels in my time, which was bad enough, but never a beloved pet that someone would miss. I could not exorcise this thought. It kept invading my mind. That first night with the car, I dreamt of the dog. He was built along the same lines as a German Shepherd, i.e., the same size and erect ears, but with longish, shaggy, dark gray hair. I don't remember the dream directly. This was over a decade ago, and this is the memory of a memory. I don't remember any other details. The next day, I went on a long hike and managed to forget about the dog for a while. But as I drove home, the dog entered my mind again. I was driving down a winding, forested road, thinking about the dog. Suddenly, a large dog ran out in front of me. Under other circumstances, I think I would have hit it. But because I was thinking about a dog running out in front of me, my reflexes were primed and ready for it. I hit the brakes and slowed down enough so that I didn't hit the dog. It ran off sheepishly into the forest. This wasn't the dog from my dream. It was a Rottweiler. But it was dark and about the same size. I don't believe that this was a premonition, since I don't believe in such things. It was likely a form of confirmation bias. You see, I frequently feel anxious about doing certain things. I might think, I should drive to work this way because that way feels bad. But when I ignore these feelings, nothing bad happens. I've largely come to accept that my anxieties are unproductive emotions. I think that my worries about hitting and killing a dog were just a random manifestation of my natural anxieties, and the fact that I nearly did hit a dog just fortified my memory of the event. i.e., I've probably experienced many other false premonitions that I have forgotten since nothing came of them. When I was a teenager, I was camping with some friends in an alpine hut. I would have been 14-15-ish. We'd hiked in through the bush and hadn't seen anyone else since we were dropped off that morning. It was late at night, in the middle of winter. I was the only one still awake. It was a full moon and a clear night, and moonlight was streaming in through the window, casting a big light patch on the wall opposite me. I remember it clearly, right down to the shadow of the cross between the window panes. Imagine, if you will, someone walking up behind you as you face towards a wall with the headlights of a car behind you. I'm sure you can imagine the way you would see their shadow, clearly humanoid, looming up alongside your own. Well, lying there on the floor of this old hut, with only one person awake, I saw that shadow. In the rectangle of moonlight opposite me, I saw a shadow like that of a person walking towards the hut grow up the wall over about 20 seconds. It even swayed slightly from side to side, as a person's shadow would with each footstep. When the shadow was filling about 3/4 of the moonlit space on the wall, it suddenly shot to the side, as if a person had suddenly dived away to avoid being seen. I got up and looked out the door, and there was no one there. I woke up my best friend and told him I thought someone was outside. We went all around the hut, and there was no one out there. We called out into the night, and there was no response. We were about 20 kilometers from the nearest highway, on a remote bush track, so it's not like there were many casual passers-by. There were certainly no vehicles nearby that we could hear the sound of, and like I said, we hadn't seen anyone since that morning when we were dropped off. It is pretty much the most unnerving thing I have ever seen. I've never seen anything like it since, and to this day, I can't think of a rational explanation for it. I was hiking on a trail I was very familiar with, and because of changes in the weather, I decided to leave the trail and cut through the woods. I wanted to try to get to my car before a downpour, and I knew this area like the back of my hand. Before I knew it, I felt very strange and disoriented, and nothing looked familiar. I'm not sure if the woods seemed silent before or after I felt this way, but I became undeniably aware of how silent everything was. A pressingly downright, suffocating silence, and my heart began to pound as I stood in place, and it felt as if the woods were spinning and closing in around me like I had stepped into something I could not comprehend. It was then that I noticed something about 15 feet in front of me. It was 10 feet high and about 8 feet wide, with a distortion. It was like something was bending the light and moving towards me like a fogged-up mirror, almost, but with no definitive shape, but it was moving with purpose and intelligence and would be completely unrecognizable if not for the distortion within and me directly looking at it. I turned to run and realized another was behind me, the same size and shapeless. Almost it was then that I realized there were at least 4 of these things closing in on me, and I was trapped. What I was seeing, my brain could not make sense of, and I was in utter panic and shock and backed up against a tree because I was terrified to run in the direction of these things. I curled up in a fetal position and put my hands over my ears because they had begun ringing and the sound was deafening, and I closed my eyes as these intelligent cloaked things were all around me, about 5 feet from me. I saw a white flash, like what would happen if you were ever hit hard in the head, fell, or punched. That's the best way I can describe it. My ears were ringing, there was a flash, and then nothing. I woke up to rain falling on me, and hours had passed. Everything was normal, and I knew where I was. I gathered myself, checked for injuries, and realized I was completely fine. Shakingly, I left the woods and drove home. I can't make sense of what happened. I have Googled similar events but found nothing quite like what has happened to me, and I really need answers. I stumbled across stealth cloaking technologies used by the military, and the technology is primitive compared to what I witnessed or what these beings or things were, if it was technology or a living thing. I just don't know, I don't have answers, and I don't know what happened to me or why. My partner and I were camping up on Lake Superior recently. It was misty or rainy all weekend, so we barely saw the lake. We were hiking along a beach when we saw a large figure standing on a rocky outcrop staring at us about 50 feet away. We sorted out that it was a bird, and I first guessed osprey or golden eagle. It took us a moment to discern that it was a raven because of its huge size. We heard them at the campground, so that followed. The raven looked so spooky, just quietly watching us through the mist. We look at each other, and my partner says, "Let's go closer." We took one step, and I suggested we make a bubble of protection. We have done this before when entering spooky forests and whatnot. We don't know of any particular method other than intently imagining a protective bubble radiating outward. We typically stand side by side, as we're usually walking when we do this, and sort of do our own bubble thing. This time, we faced each other, held hands, gazed into each other's eyes, and imagined the protective bubble. About 3 seconds into this action, the raven flew over us and caught a few times. It wasn't directly overhead, but very close to it. What are people's thoughts about this? What does the raven symbolize here? Was it always a good omen that blessed us, or did we scare it off with our bubble of protection? My dad, grandma, grandpa, and I were attending my cousin's wedding in a small rural town just outside of South Haven, Michigan, late last summer. We rented a small house in town, which was located in a very wooded area just off of a small lake. Something felt extremely off as soon as I got out of the car at our rental property. That's the best way I could describe it, something felt off, and I was immediately uneasy. But, being the skeptic that I am, I shrugged it off and chalked it up to being tired and anxious. The night we arrived, my dad and I were having a smoke outside and noticed how weird everything sounded. It was about 11 p.m., and there was no one else around. The trees were crackling incredibly loudly, and we were hearing strange animal noises, but nothing too out of the ordinary. Just the type of animal noises you would hear in rural Michigan. But they just sounded particularly strange to us for some reason. We said our goodnights and went to bed. The next morning, my dad told me that he went outside for a smoke at about 2ish that morning and heard what sounded to him like someone close by banging on metal siding. He said it sounded like it was just next door, but he didn't hear anything leading up to or preceding the loud banging, like footsteps or anything like that. We shrugged and laughed it off. The second night was when I heard the thing that I still can't stop thinking about 6 months later. It was about 11 p.m. or midnight, and I was having my last smoke of the night. My grandparents were already asleep, and my dad had just gotten into bed but was still awake watching TV. I was sitting on the stairs outside with my back to the house, looking straight out into the backyard. I heard someone shout my name in a very abrupt manner, loud and fast. It sounded like they were shouting towards me from the front of the house, like they were standing on the front porch shouting for me, knowing I was at the back of the house. It sounded just like my dad, but it couldn't be him because I didn't hear the front door open, close, or anything. Being a skeptic, I reminded myself to stay calm, and I quickly walked back into the house. My dad was sound asleep. There was no way that by the time I got to him, he could have gotten back into bed. I woke him up and asked him if he was outside screaming my name. He looked confused and said, "Of course not." I started to get really freaked out at this point. I tried to go to bed but couldn't get that scream out of my head. I was up all night trying to figure out what happened. I was honestly contemplating leaving, getting a hotel room somewhere close by, and returning in the morning. Miraculously, I must have fallen asleep sometime around 3 a.m. We woke up the next morning, and I was so ready to get the hell out of that town. As soon as we left, the uneasy feeling I had the entire weekend disappeared. When I returned to work the next day, I told my coworker about the weird experience I had. Her face immediately dropped. She proceeded to inform me that this is quite common in the Appalachian area regarding cryptids and other types of creatures. Apparently they try to get your attention by mimicking someone close to you, and when you look at them, they kidnap you or something along those lines. But I was in Michigan? I tried to look up information about the town I was in, but I didn't find anything remotely interesting. Has anyone else had a similar experience? Hiking alone always used to be a great way for me to clear my head, have some time alone, and get a workout in as well. After what happened this morning, I doubt I will ever hike alone again. It was around 6 a.m., and I was surprised that it was as light as it was, so I decided to go earlier than I had originally planned. I have hiked this trail many times because it's so close to the area I live in, the Colorado Rocky Mountains, for anyone looking to identify region-specific creatures, both alone and with a group of people. I have never had an experience in this canyon, though I have heard that it is haunted, as many Native Americans are rumored to be buried all along the canyon, which is peppered with many hiking trails and a beautiful drive. I set off on my hike, and nothing was out of the ordinary. There were only two people I encountered, a woman who was running down the trail and a man birdwatching. I got past the main flat part of the trail where there was a big clearing, and I could see about 100 feet in every direction and into the more heavily wooded area with a steep hill to my left and a creek to my right. Around this time, I started hearing someone shouting. It sounded very far off, and I couldn't distinguish any words. I figured maybe someone was calling for their dog or someone else. It came and went intermittently, as if it were on the wind, but I did notice that the voice was saying the same thing over and over again, in a strange intonation that sounded almost sing-song. I was not afraid at this time, with it being light out and having seen other people on the trail. I stopped to take a couple of pictures right off of the main trail. The light was gorgeous and hitting the water and greenery beautifully, and then began walking again. Maybe 5 minutes later is when I heard it. The same voice I had heard earlier, except it sounded as if it were directly above me on the slope. I instantly felt a chill and began looking around for the source of the noise, but I couldn't see anyone. It was close enough that even through the summer foliage, I should have been able to see the person, if it was a person. I still could not make out what the voice was saying, but it was a two-syllable word. At this point, I wondered if it was a psycho looking for a young female hiker to murder, as that's often something I worry about when I hike alone. I bolted back down the way I came, practically running down the trail. I heard a crash behind me, as if something heavy had landed on tree branches and cracked them. I've spent most of my life in and around forest animals. I know what deer and smaller creatures sound like, and this sounded much bigger and much clumsier, like what people sound like when they go through the undergrowth. Again, I was still thinking that I was going to have an untimely demise on my morning hike from some serial killer, and I picked up my pace, hoping to outrun whoever now seemed to be chasing me. Luckily, I didn't see anyone chasing after me, and the voice seemed to stay in the same location. It may have just been the panic of the situation, but I could have sworn that the voice changed its unintelligible word to my name as I ran away from it, which is one syllable, and just drew it out long with the same intonation. It was odd, as if it were just going, ka-a-a, ka-a-a. It was at this moment that I realized that I might not be dealing with a psycho at all, but something paranormal, because no one out there should have known my name. After I reached the main flat area of the trail, the voice disappeared completely. I made it to my car in about 15 minutes. I hadn't gotten very far on my hike, and I drove up the road. The road runs parallel to the trail for almost a mile across the creek, and so I was hoping to see if I could see anyone from a slightly higher perspective. I didn't see anyone and drove to a different location to finish my hike, somewhere a lot more populated. Which, in hindsight, also wasn't a smart move because the trail is also rumored to be haunted. Nothing else strange happened, though I was still shaken up and trying to convince myself it was someone calling for their dog. Now, I have some theories because, as I said, the entire canyon is rumored to be haunted. It may have been a ghost of some sort, but because of the Native Americans that inhabited the area for a long time, I wondered if it may have been a Wendigo. From my scant knowledge, I know they can imitate human voices, but I'm not sure if they would know my name. I'm a little freaked out, especially because this haunted canyon is only miles from my house. Any help would be much appreciated. Thank you. I was hiking on a decommissioned Forest Service trail in the backcountry with my boyfriend. We were going on the rainy side of the ridge, but it was still pretty hot that day. We went through all our water on the first half of the hike and still had a couple miles to go before we reached the lake. Even though we were in pretty decent shape, it was a fairly demanding elevation climb. As we reached the top of the ridge, we came across another hiker. We weren't expecting this on a decommissioned trail, we weren't even supposed to be there. He was an elderly gentleman in his late 60s and early 70s. He had a vintage wool cap on and a heavy red flannel jacket, the kind woodsmen wore in the 1960s. He was pushing an odeograph wheel along the ground. I noticed he was carrying a variety of other measuring tools tucked into his pockets. I figured that explained his unseasonably warm attire. In the age of GPS, it was strange to see someone packing old-school analog tools, but not unheard of. GPS reception was spotty in the mountains, and the old-timers don't trust it. Nonetheless, I was surprised to see an older person out there on such challenging terrain. As we were about to pass, I smiled and greeted him. I asked, "How's it looking on top?" He paused briefly, and his eyes met mine. They were striking, even with his thick horn-rimmed lenses. "There's a storm coming. I'm not sure I'd go past the timber too far. They've really let this trail go to hell. I'm going to take this up with the chief. You take care." And he continued on. He didn't say boo to my boyfriend. We exchanged puzzled glances. I'm concerned about a little old man, who seems a little senile, out there. As soon as he's out of earshot, I whisper to my boyfriend that we should backtrack a little just to make sure he's not lost. He agrees, and we turn to follow him. He passed a bend through some bushes and vanished. We looked and listened, but there was nothing. At this point, I'm worried he fell into the steep terrain, so we continued down the mountain, retracing our steps and looking for him. It's as if he had never been there. At this point, we're both worried. So we go all the way down and back to the pullout in the road where we parked. There were no other cars. There were no other places to park. No other cars were there when we started, and there are none now. Then the hail started. It had been clear skies and warm just minutes prior. It was so bad that we ran for the car to get some cover. Finally, we decided it would be best to get some help. So we drove about 10 miles up the road to a gas station. It's a rural area, so we figured the locals would probably have some idea of who he was. We asked the attendant at the station, and he just laughed. "Oh, you saw him, too. We've all seen him." He shakes his head. "You know the name of the lake up there?" "No," I tell me. He chuckled and said, "It's Old Man Lake." I still don't know if he was trolling us or what, but it was the weirdest thing. I won't call it creepy, but strange. Also, the natives have legends about spirits in the woods. Their people regard those lands as a gateway to the spirit world. Apparitions appear to people from all time periods and cultures. My boyfriend and I could never agree on the details of the man's appearance, even though we were both standing right there. I'm not saying I do or don't believe the legends, I'm agnostic about those sorts of things, but it's hard for me to explain rationally. Dunno. Back in the early 2000s, I was around 7 or 8 years old. I used to live in a small town, in a big house with a large backyard. My parents used to work all day long, and I was alone all afternoon, but I was never afraid, with 2 dogs, one of them was the dog of my other reporter, and lots of imagination to play. I used to play camp with my friend named Leandro, one of our favorite plays, and on that fateful afternoon, we were playing that. In the late afternoon, some time before my parents got home, my friend said to me that he needed to leave, and at this time, he did not help me to pick up all the toys and camp stuff, which I thought was rude. I was picking up all the stuff, and my dogs aren't around at this time, but I haven't noticed that. At the end of storage, I was about to enter the house when I looked back. What I saw shocked me. I was a very fearful kid, not a fan of supernatural things, and so afraid of aliens, which I love to study about today, so I just freaked out. My backyard was very large and divided into 2. We had lots of trees and little benches made of cut logs. Near one of these benches in the middle of the backyard, I saw a creature. It was green and a little taller than me at the time, maybe 30 meters. It looked pretty ridiculous when I think about it today, like the drawings of aliens made by kids, which makes me wonder if it wasn't just my imagination, but it seems so real to me even today. It wasn't disproportionate at all, not ugly, just very strange. And all green. His hands were on the top of the bench, and he looked directly at me. His eyes weren't evil, but, like I said, I wasn't the most brave kid in the world. I just remember running with all my strength into the house and finding one of my dogs inside. I was so afraid that I just hugged my little dog and waited for my parents to get home. The worst thing is that I cannot ever talk about it with my parents. Years later, I was telling that story in circles of horror stories with friends, but it never occurred to me again how messed up that experience was. What do you guys think I saw that day? I'm sure I'll never forget this shit. This story takes place sometime in the 70s, most likely in the early to mid 70s. My mom was born in 1965 and remembers this story clearly. My aunts as well remember this happening, but no one knows exactly what year. One summer day, John decided to take his family on a small outing with the intent of having a picnic in the woods. My mother, her 3 sisters, and her mother/grandmother were all there and very excited about this. Where we are from, my family is more than accustomed to the woods and has lived in this area for generations. Going into the woods for a fun family activity was nothing out of the ordinary and seemed to be just another normal day. They made their way down a dirt backwoods road and stopped once they found a clearing large enough to accommodate them. As all the kids started jumping out of the car and messing around as kids do after being stuck together, my grandmother began unloading their food and picnic supplies. John began surveying the area and deciding where to set up. As he was doing that, something in the woods past the clearing caught his eye. Before going to see what was out there, he yelled to the family and said he would be right back. The kids and my grandmother thought not much of this since they are all used to the woods, and these woods, in particular, were very familiar to them. They continued unloading and setting up the stuff they brought. One of the girls pointed out something in the clearing that caused a sudden shift from a normal day to something far worse. It was a dirt mound that looked like something was buried under it. This mound was about the size of a small person, maybe even child-sized. It was too big to simply be any animal in these woods. There were nothing but squirrels and raccoons in the area. Scattered amongst the mound were larger river rocks. There was no pattern, but they were definitely placed on the mound intentionally. Also, the dirt seemed to be fresh, as though just buried. It was loose and slightly darker than the area around it. The mood immediately shifted from an average day in the woods to something much darker. My grandmother became concerned and told the girls to stay away from it. She was clearly upset and worried about it, but she did her best to ignore it. The girls, all being children, didn't have the same amount of worry and continued playing while just avoiding the mound. They tried to return to their picnic, and the girls were already chasing each other in circles again. It was supposed to be a joyous, sunny day, and my grandmother wanted to keep it that way. Things seemed to return to normal for a while. The trees around them created a wall of dense foliage, blocking their view of anything inside the forest. One of the girls again took notice of something strange. It was immediately clear what it was. Along one of the long branches of the tree hung a noose. It was tied with rope and hung high above their heads. A lump of dirt can be explained away by nature, but someone had to have placed the noose there. My grandmother stopped dead in her tracks when she first saw it. Something was wrong, very, very wrong. They couldn't just pack up and leave. John was still out in the woods. Even children can recognize a noose as a symbol of death. The children started to become very anxious. Whatever innocence was keeping them from worrying about the mound had completely vanished. My grandmother, the resilient woman she is, soothed her children and told them it was just left by deer hunters. But she knew in her heart they needed to leave. No deer hunter would hang a deer and then bury it, at least no sane deer hunter. It wasn't until they started hearing something in the woods that they began to really panic. My grandmother, as well as all the children, began hearing a rhythmic chanting from deep in the woods. It sounded as though there was a group of people all singing in deep voices to the beat of a drum. It went in a quick bum 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 pattern, 3 steady beats followed by a pause, and then it would repeat. It sounded far away, but immediately fear began to take hold of each of them. They each listened and gathered together. As the seconds passed, it began to increase in volume. It was getting not just louder, but closer. What started out as a distant echo soon began to engulf the entire clearing. My grandmother was terrified and wanted so desperately to leave, but John had yet to return. They waited, fear-ridden, as the sound began to fill their chests. It felt like they were at a concert as the deep bass began to vibrate in their chests. It was everywhere and constant. It was as though the sound was being made by the trees themselves, surrounding the family in every direction. Suddenly, the sound of yelling broke through the constant drone of chanting. John's voice was yelling out to them from the trees. "Go," he yelled. "Get in the car." He came running out of the woods, yelling that they needed to leave. They had never seen as much terror in this man as they had at this moment. He was a man afraid of nothing, unbothered by the world around him. This was the most emotion any of them had ever seen from him. He saw something in those woods, something that shook his very being to the core. My grandmother began throwing everything back in the car as the kids got in as well. John and my grandmother picked up their things and, as quickly as possible, threw them all into the car. They had no care for the things they were packing up due to their fear. Food was all over the trunk, and items were broken. After everything was tossed in, they both got in the car and drove away. This is where the main plot of the story ends. But one fact from this story is what has really caused me to wonder all these years. My grandfather has refused to ever speak of what he saw. He never told any of the children or my grandmother. Every time this was brought up, he quickly rebuffed it and angrily told them not to ask again. He never went to the police or told someone outside of the family. My grandfather is the only person who knows what happened that day. When I first heard the story, I swore to myself that I would ask him one day. Now I can't, and I regret it greatly. By the time I was in high school, he had moved out of the state with other family members, and I mostly lost contact with him outside of occasional happy birthday calls or letters. This story doesn't have an answer to go with it. When he died, the only thing I was sad about was never knowing what happened that day. We weren't close when I got older, and once I learned of all the abuse he caused, I separated myself from him. His death looms over me, and this story still haunts me to this day. My mother and aunts just look back on it as a spooky memory from their childhood. There is nothing more than a story to spook the little ones at Thanksgiving with. I am one of the only people in the family who is still curious about what happened. I have always been interested in mysteries, the occult, horror, and conspiracy theories. This story piqued my interest more than any others in my family. By the way, this isn't the only strange story from my family, but it definitely is the most strange. I wish I had answers. My cousin and I grew up spending many weekends and summers at our grandmother's. I lived in the same town but in a different camp, a term from the place's mining days. My camp provided less kid-friendly places to play outside, dangerous streets, more dense woods, and leftover barbed wire fences. Gran lived on a dead-end road, and until our 10th birthday, she rarely allowed us to pass the stop sign. She knew everyone in the two back camps and occasionally allowed us to cross the trail between her street and the next street, where several relatives lived, but never farther. We set out to explore the woods behind the ballpark as soon as we turned 10. They held a haunted trail every October, and we knew people rode bikes and ATVs behind it, meaning someone kept the trails clear. In the last few weeks of summer vacation, we spent a lot of time navigating the area. From the back of the ballpark, we used the entrance of the haunted trail to reach the new cemetery in one direction and the lake in the other. We actually only made it to a point where we saw the lake from a distance because the terrain looked a bit difficult for our size. We needed a machete. People never rode back there, it flooded sometimes and always smelled. Following around the lake led to banks more easily penetrated, but those were long walks we couldn't take between breakfast and lunch or between lunch and dinner. Gran expected us home for meals. School began, and we quit exploring the woods on weekends. We mapped everything we could reach anyway. Instead, we rode our bikes and played with other kids. There were easier places to play. In early autumn, we all noticed the woods were easier to hike, while hide and seek got a lot more difficult. The weather held a loose pattern of summer heat, then rain, then chilly days. Jack and I started talking about the lake again. We started talking to Gran and Pa about the lake. After a few weekends, Gran told us to have fun exploring and suggested we pack a lunch. Pa gave us an old hunting knife in case of run-ins, an unruly brush, and a big thermos. We found some rope, we always took rope and a flashlight to the woods, and a plastic tablecloth. They made sure we knew not to go in the water, and Gran expected us back before dinner. We walked to the park and used the mudhole entrance at the side. That trail provided a straight shot to a clearing we saw on the bank of what everyone called a slough. It wasn't a long walk. We found some cliffs when we arrived. The dead flora made it much easier to reach than the thick summer growth. Thinking about it, they weren't real cliffs, but they were to us at 10. The lowest drop was about 4 feet, and the highest was maybe 7. The drops were all slippery and muddier than the clearing. Moss covered the floor of the clearing. Glad we brought the rope, we tied it to a live tree and used it to guide him onto firm land. It was mostly rock, or maybe concrete. I wore an analog watch every day at that age. Jack wore a digital sports watch with a ton of fancy features I doubted he knew how to use. We both got them for Christmas. My stomach grumbled, and I saw it was lunchtime. We spread the checkered cloth and pulled the excessive amount of food from the lunchbox. It didn't take us long to eat a sandwich each, and we started exploring the area around the slough. We climbed up and down the rope. We used the knife to cut branches for forts and swords. We made spears. We watched for animals and tried to catch frogs along the bank. We saw fish and turtles making ripples in the water. We debated making a raft but decided against it because sometimes we heard the adults say the water was bad. We fished for brim in it but always threw them back. We caught some deformed ones and some odd turtles. It disappointed me, we forgot to bring a fishing line. Jack said we still had time to go get lines and be back before dinner. I looked at my watch, and it was the same time we ate lunch. I knew at least 2 hours had passed. He was right, even if my battery had died, we had time to fish a little at dusk, if not in the slough, then at our usual spot at the end of Grand Street. We packed our bags and headed home. We walked until Jack asked me the time. He said his watch wasn't working. Mine was too, so I examined the sun. I couldn't tell how long we'd been walking. He pointed to one of the huts we made. I told him we weren't lost. He always worried about getting lost. No matter the direction we walked, I knew we'd hit something familiar if we stayed in one direction. Away from the lake, there'd be some backyards, a road, the cemetery, or the ballpark. The third time we came to the slough, Jack started knotting trees. I made arrows from branches. It started to get dark, almost dinner time. There was no reason for us to be lost. Even with the change of season, I knew we weren't walking in a circle. The fourth and fifth times, we never even saw our markers. Jack became convinced the neighbor kids were messing with us. After dark, I decided to climb the first big tree we found. I saw the glow from street lights in front of us. We walked in that direction and passed the tree another time. We almost decided to split in opposite directions when I heard Gran yelling our names. Boy, was she mad, waiting at the trail entrance? We explained to her that both our watch batteries had died, and then we got lost. I showed her my watch. It read 9 at night. So did Jack's, which had been blank. Christmas night, 2007, rural backroads in upstate New York. The day was pleasant and festive, opening presents early in the morning with my sisters, a hearty breakfast made by Dad, delicious smells from the kitchen as Mom and Dad prepared a feast, visits from extended family bringing pies and cakes for dessert. Around 2, we all sat down to eat and then lazed about for the rest of the afternoon into the evening. At about 8, after everyone had left and the food was all put away for round 2 the following day, I decided to head over to visit my friend in the next village. The drive would be about 10 minutes if I took back roads to get there. So, I did. First, a little background on where my friend lived. It was a housing development surrounding a private lake, you might call it a gated community. You could still drive through it freely after hours by entering one of the 4 private entry points. Since the community was built around a lake, the roads surrounding it took on a sort of spiral shape. The houses were sparsely positioned on the outermost part of the spiral road, closest to the 4 private entry points. As you drove in further, there were a lot more houses positioned closer together, nearer the lake. My friend lived on the outer edge of this development, so once I reached the entry point, it would only take me another few minutes until I reached his house. His house, along with all the others, were far enough apart that you couldn't see them from the road as you drove by. There were either woods all around with long drives or open fields with long drives. You could see porch lights in the distance, but that was about it. As I entered the development, the speed limit dropped from 30 miles per hour to 20. There were no street lights in the development, and for some reason, I never put my high beams on. I couldn't go any faster than the speed limit because there were speed bumps in place every 30 feet or so for a bit. It was a mild night. I remember having my driver's side window open slightly to take in some fresh air. I remember driving in silence, which was unusual for me. I normally always listen to music when driving. I must have been enjoying the quietness after the commotion of the day. I reached a section of road that had barren fields on either side and woods set back. Houses were probably nestled back into the trees. As I drove, I noticed what looked like someone walking up ahead on the opposite side of the road, coming in my direction. Mind you, I was still going about 20 miles per hour the whole time, so it was probably less than a minute by the time the walker came into clear view. I got a quick scan of it from my windscreen before I got my car, and they were exactly parallel. This is what I saw. It was not a person. It stood on 2 long legs, with long arms hanging down from its shoulders. It was strong looking. Lean and muscular, but not beefy in stature. It looked thin at the same time. It stood at least 7 feet tall. It was light colored. I was not sure whether it was white, tan, yellow, or grayish. It didn't appear to have fur, but there was some texture to the skin. It wasn't smooth. There appeared to be something coming off its back. I don't know what this was. All I can recall about its face is the small features it had, but the mouth and jaw were notably large. And it had pointed things atop its head, 2 things going straight upward with something mingled between the 2 things. That's what I got from a quick scan and from my observation of it as it neared my car. As my car became parallel to it within a split second, I went from looking out my windscreen to looking at it from my driver's side window. In that moment, its face quickly peered down at me, and all I remember was the mouth opening wide. Out came a remarkable scream that I'll never forget. It gives me chills just thinking about it. It consisted of a high-pitched shrill or shriek, enveloped by a deep guttural growl. Both sounds happened simultaneously in that scream. I kept driving all the while. This was all happening so fast that I didn't even have a chance to be scared, shocked, or anything. I continued driving, went past my friend's house, and drove home. I called him to tell him what happened and that I just needed to get back. I was probably running on adrenaline to get back home. Later on, I was in total shock after it sank in. Had my driver's side window been fully opened, it would have touched me, or worse, taken me. I'm certain of it. To this day, I still haven't worked out what this was. Anyone else see anything like this or hear what I heard?